You know what's absolutely wild? Pretty much everything you learned about Native Americans in school was either incomplete, oversimplified, or just flat out wrong. And I'm not even exaggerating here. There's this massive, canyon-sized gap between what gets taught in textbooks and what actually happened in history. We're talking about facts so incredible, so mind-blowing, that they've been conveniently left out of mainstream education for generations, and some of them, they're so surprising that when you first hear them, your brain does this thing where it goes, "Nah, that can't be right." But here's the thing, they are right. They're documented, verified, and backed by archaeological evidence, historical records, and modern scholarship. We're talking about advanced democracies that directly inspired the US Constitution, cities that were larger than London and Paris, technologies and agricultural methods so sophisticated that modern scientists are still studying them, medical procedures that were centuries ahead of European medicine, and a population collapse so devastating it changed the entire planet's climate. Today, we're diving deep into 20 facts about Native Americans that are so surprising, so contrary to the narrative you were probably taught, that you'll wonder why nobody ever told you this stuff before. And fair warning, some of these are going to completely flip your understanding of American history upside down. Some of them are uncomfortable. Some of them are inspiring. All of them are true. So buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through the history they didn't teach you in school. Let's get into it. The Iroquois Confederacy directly influenced the U.S. Constitution. All right, let's start with something that should be common knowledge, but somehow isn't. Picture this. It's 1744, and Benjamin Franklin is sitting at a treaty negotiation in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He's watching how the Iroquois Confederacy conducts its business. And he's absolutely fascinated. He's taking notes like a college student who just discovered they have a final exam tomorrow. But Franklin isn't just impressed by their diplomatic skills, he is literally studying their entire governmental system. And he's not alone. Many of the founding fathers were well aware of the Iroquois Confederacy and its sophisticated political structure. Now, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, wasn't some loose alliance. This was a functioning, complex democracy with checks and balances that had been operating for centuries before Europeans even knew America existed. Some scholars believe it was founded as early as 1142 AD, though dates vary. Either way, we're talking about a democratic system that was ancient by the time the US Constitution was being written. The Iroquois had something called the Great Law of Peace, basically their constitution, and this thing was sophisticated. It included concepts like federalism, where different nations maintained their sovereignty while participating in a larger union. Sound familiar? It had separation of powers, with different councils handling different responsibilities. It had a system of checks and balances where no single person or group could dominate. It even had impeachment procedures for leaders who abused their power. Oh, and here's something that'll blow your mind. The Iroquois system gave women significant political power. Clan mothers could nominate and remove chiefs. They had veto power over declarations of war. This was happening while European women couldn't vote, own property, or have any say in government. When the founding fathers were struggling to figure out how to unite 13 colonies into one nation while preserving individual colony rights, they looked at the Iroquois and basically went, "Yeah, these guys figured it out already. Let's learn from them." Benjamin Franklin explicitly referenced the Iroquois Confederacy and his Albany Plan of Union in 1754. He literally wrote, "It would be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies." Now, some historians debate exactly how much direct influence the Iroquois had versus European Enlightenment thinking, but here's what we know for certain. The founding fathers were aware of the Iroquois system, they referenced it, they met with Iroquois leaders, and they incorporated similar structures into the U.S. Constitution. In fact, in 1988, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution officially acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the Constitution and the development of American democracy. That's not speculation or theory, that's officially recognized by the U.S. government. So the next time someone talks about American democracy being purely a product of European Enlightenment thinking, or ancient Greek philosophy, you can drop this knowledge bomb on them. The blueprint for American federalism was being used successfully in North America long before anyone thought to write the Constitution. FACT to Cahokia was larger than London in 1250 AD. Let me transport you back in time. The year is 1250 AD. You're standing on a bluff near present-day St. Louis, Missouri. Looking out over a massive urban landscape, you see enormous earthen pyramids rising above the horizon. You see thousands of homes arranged in planned neighborhoods. You see a bustling central plaza filled with people trading goods from across the continent. You see astronomical observatories, public buildings, and infrastructure that speaks of advanced urban planning. You're standing in Cahokia, and you're looking at a city with somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000 people at its peak. For context, that's larger than London at the same time. London in 1250 had maybe 15,000 to 18,000 people and was basically a crowded, medieval mess with terrible sanitation and no urban planning. Now let me describe what you are seeing in more detail, because this is important. The centerpiece of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, named after monks who lived nearby in the 1800s, long after Cahokia was abandoned. This thing is massive. It covers more than 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet high in 4 terraces. To put that in perspective, it's bigger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Building Monk's Mound required moving more than 14.6 million cubic feet of earth. And remember, these people didn't have wheels, horses, or metal tools. They did this with baskets, digging tools, and incredible organization. It's estimated that it took about 300 years to complete, which means this was a multi-generational project that required long-term planning, stable social organization, and the ability to mobilize large numbers of people. But Monk's Mound was just one of about 120 earthen mounds in Cahokia. The city had mounds for different purposes: residential mounds where elite families lived, ceremonial mounds, burial mounds. They had a woodhenge, a circle of wooden posts that functioned as an astronomical observatory for tracking solstices and other celestial events. The urban planning was sophisticated. There was a central plaza the size of 45 football fields. Neighborhoods were arranged in organized patterns. There's evidence of palisade walls around certain sections, suggesting both defense and urban zoning. They had a sophisticated water management system to deal with flooding from the nearby Mississippi River, and the trade network, absolutely incredible. Archaeologists have found copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, and tools made from stone sources hundreds of miles away. This wasn't an isolated village, this was a major urban center at the heart of a continental trade network. Cahokia was the center of what archaeologists call Mississippian culture, which stretched across much of the eastern United States. It influenced art, religion, trade, and political organization across a huge area. This was a cultural superpower. But here is what really gets me, and this should make you angry, and most Americans have never even heard of Cahokia. It's not in most history textbooks. It's not taught in schools. When people think of great ancient cities, they think of Rome, Athens, Cairo, Beijing. They don't think of a massive Native American metropolis that rivaled or exceeded European cities of its time. It's like if historians just decided to erase New York City from all the history books. Or if we just collectively agreed to pretend London never existed. That's essentially what's happened with Cahokia, an American historical consciousness. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a state historic site, but it gets a fraction of the visitors that far less impressive historical sites receive. We've essentially erased one of the most impressive pre-Columbian cities in North America from our collective memory. And Cahokia wasn't unique. It was the largest. But there were other Mississippian cities throughout the east and southeast, Mountville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, Spiro in Oklahoma. These were all significant urban centers with mound complexes and sophisticated societies. The fact that this isn't common knowledge, that most Americans go through their entire education without learning about Cahokia, tells you something about whose history gets told and whose gets erased. Fact 3. Native Americans practiced advanced sustainable farming that modern agriculture is only now rediscovering. Okay. You've probably heard of the Three Sisters agricultural method: corn, beans, and squash planted together. Maybe you learned about it in elementary school as a fun fact and then never thought about it again. But this isn't just some cute gardening hack that makes for a nice story. This is genuinely brilliant, sophisticated agricultural science that modern farmers and agricultural researchers are only now fully appreciating. Let me break down why this is so genius. When you plant corn, beans, and squash together, you're not just saving space, you're creating a symbiotic ecosystem where each plant supports the others. The corn stalks grow tall and strong. The beans, which are nitrogen-fixing legumes, climb up the corn stalks instead of requiring separate poles or supports. As the beans grow, their roots have special nodules that contain bacteria. These bacteria take nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form that plants can use. This nitrogen enriches the soil, feeding the corn and squash. Essentially, the beans are manufacturing fertilizer. The squash grows low to the ground, spreading out round the base of the corn and beans. Its large, prickly leaves create a living mulch that serves multiple purposes. First, it shades the soil, which reduces evaporation and keeps moisture in the ground. Second, it prevents weeds from growing by blocking sunlight. Third, those prickly leaves deter pests like raccoons and rodents from getting to the corn. But it gets even better. The corn provides the structure for the beans to climb, which means they get maximum sun exposure. The beans stabilize the corn stalks in high winds. The decomposing bean and squash leaves add organic matter to the soil. The different root depths mean the plants aren't competing for the same nutrients and water. Corn has shallow roots, beans have medium-depth roots, and squash has deep roots that also break up compacted soil. This is permaculture and companion planting taken to an art form. It's a closed-loop system that improves the soil over time rather than depleting it. And remember, this system was developed thousands of years ago through careful observation and experimentation. Now contrast this with European agricultural methods at the time. European farming was basically plow a field, plant wheat or whatever, harvest it, repeat until the soil is exhausted, then move to a new field. They practiced crop rotation eventually, but even that was less sophisticated than the Three Sisters. European agriculture depleted soil, required fallowing fields, and needed external inputs like manure to maintain fertility. The Three Sisters system was just one example of sophisticated Native American agriculture. Different regions developed different techniques perfectly adapted to their environments. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans developed complex irrigation systems and created gardens in seemingly impossible desert conditions. They practiced water harvesting and built terraces to prevent erosion. The Hohokam in Arizona built over 500 miles of irrigation canals, some of which were so well engineered that modern Phoenix uses the same routes for their canal system. In the Amazon, indigenous peoples created terra preta, or black earth, a super fertile soil that they engineered by incorporating charcoal and organic waste. This soil remains incredibly fertile hundreds of years later, and scientists are still trying to figure out exactly how to replicate it. Modern interest in biochar for carbon sequestration and soil improvement is basically trying to recreate what Amazonian peoples figured out centuries ago. Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest managed salmon runs and created clam gardens, rock-walled terraces in the intertidal zone that increased shellfish production. These weren't just hunting and gathering. These were sophisticated forms of aquaculture and ecosystem management. Across the eastern woodlands, Native Americans used controlled burns to manage forests and create edge habitats that increased biodiversity and game populations. This wasn't random fire. This was carefully planned land management based on deep ecological knowledge. Modern agricultural science is increasingly recognizing that many Native American farming methods are more sustainable, more resilient to climate change, and better for soil health than industrial agriculture. We're essentially rediscovering knowledge that was already developed centuries ago. There are now agricultural programs specifically studying and reviving traditional Native American farming techniques. Scientists are looking at how to incorporate these methods into modern sustainable agriculture. Organizations are working to preserve heirloom varieties of crops that Native Americans developed over thousands of years of selective breeding. It turns out that treating the land as a living system to be managed sustainably, rather than a resource to be extracted, was the right approach all along. Imagine that technology from centuries ago being more ecologically sound than modern industrial farming. FACT for the Vanishing Indian narrative was deliberate propaganda, all right. This one's uncomfortable. But we need to talk about it because it is still affecting how people think about Native Americans. Today, there is this pervasive idea that ran through American culture for centuries, the notion of the vanishing Indian or the dying race. You've probably seen it in old movies, books, and even textbooks. The idea that Native Americans were somehow naturally fading away, disappearing into history like they were morning mist, or something equally poetic and inevitable. Except here's the thing, it wasn't natural, it wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't even really happening the way the narrative suggested. It was propaganda. Deliberate, calculated propaganda designed to justify land theft, cultural genocide, and the violation of treaties. Let me lay out some numbers for you. In 1900, the U.S. Census counted about 237,000 Native Americans. This was the population low point after centuries of disease, warfare, forced relocations, and deliberate killings. And even then, This number was probably an undercount because many native people avoided census takers or were categorized as other races. The narrative at the time was that this decline would continue until Native Americans simply ceased to exist. It was treated as sad but inevitable, the price of progress and civilization. Newspapers ran stories about the last of their tribe. Photographers like Edward Curtis created romanticized images of native people as noble but doomed relics of a bygone era. But here's what actually happened. Today, more than 9.7 million people in the United States identify as Native American or Alaska Native, either alone or in combination with other races. That is not vanishing, that is a population that more than quadrupled from its low point despite continued challenges. They didn't fade away, they survived, against incredible odds. Through unimaginable challenges, Native American communities persevered, maintained their cultures, and continued to exist as vital, living peoples. So why was this vanishing Indian narrative so popular and so persistent? Because it was convenient. Really, really convenient for a country that was built on stolen native land. Think about it psychologically. And then when people questioned why your family seemed to be struggling, I could just shrug and say, well, they were going to disappear anyway. It's just the natural order of things. This narrative shaped policy too. Why honor treaties with peoples who are going to vanish? Why invest in education or infrastructure on reservations? Why preserve languages and cultures that are supposedly dying? The vanishing Indian myth became a self-fulfilling prophecy that justified neglect and marginalization. The boarding school system, which we'll talk about more later, was partially justified by this narrative. The idea was to save native children by stripping away their culture before it disappeared anyway. Kill the Indian, save the man, but also the Indian was going to die anyway. So we're actually being merciful. And this narrative was so pervasive that it shaped how multiple generations of Americans understood native peoples. It's why even today, people are genuinely surprised to learn that Native Americans still exist, still practice their cultures, still speak their languages, still fight for their rights. I've literally had people tell me they thought Native Americans were all gone, like extinct, as if we're talking about dinosaurs. The vanishing Indian propaganda was so effective that it created a kind of cultural amnesia, where native peoples became historical figures locked in the past rather than contemporary peoples with ongoing histories. But Native Americans never vanished. They're still here. They're doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, artists, activists, scientists, politicians. They run businesses, serve in the military, attend universities. They're on social media, making films, writing books, creating art that blends traditional and contemporary forms. Native languages that were nearly extinct are being revitalized. Cultural practices that were banned for generations are being reclaimed. Young people are learning traditional skills while also navigating the modern world. Land-back movements are successfully reclaiming territory. Tribes are asserting sovereignty and self-determination. The narrative of the vanishing Indian was always a lie. It was convenient colonial propaganda that tried to erase living peoples from history while they were still standing right there. And recognizing that lie is essential to understanding both historical and contemporary Native American experiences. Be burning herbs and hoping for the best. They don't wash their hands between patients because they don't believe in germ theory. Their surgical tools are not sterile. Their understanding of anatomy is limited because dissection was forbidden for religious reasons for much of European history. Option 2. Go to a Native American healer who will give you willow bark tea for pain and inflammation. That willow bark contains salicylic acid, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. They understand cause and effect through careful observation. They've catalogued hundreds of medicinal plants and know their specific uses. They practice empirical medicine based on what works, refined through generations of experimentation. Which would you choose? Because honestly, option 2 sounds a lot better. Native Americans had sophisticated medical knowledge that was, in many ways, centuries ahead of European medicine. We're talking about genuine pharmacological knowledge, successful surgical techniques, and practical public health measures that European medicine wouldn't discover until much later. Let's start with the pharmacological knowledge, because this is where the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Native Americans used over 2,500 different plant species for medicinal purposes. And these weren't just folk remedies based on superstition. Many of them actually worked because they contained active compounds that modern science has now verified. Willow bark for pain, as I mentioned. Echinacea for immune support. Foxglove for heart conditions, which contains digitalis, still used today. Coscora sagrada as a laxative. Wild cherry bark for coughs. Golden seal as an antiseptic. Witch hazel for skin conditions. The list goes on and on. About 200 drugs in the modern pharmacopoeia, meaning the official list of medications, come directly from plants that Native Americans first used medicinally. That's not a small contribution. That's a massive transfer of knowledge that saved countless lives. When European colonists arrived, many of them would have died without Native American medical knowledge. Scurvy was killing sailors and colonists left and right. Native Americans showed them how to make vitamin C-rich teas from pine needles and other plants. Infections that would have been fatal were treated with antiseptic plants. In fact, there are multiple documented cases of colonists' lives being saved by native healers. The Pilgrims at Plymouth probably would have survived without the assistance of Squanto and other native people who taught them about local medicinal plants and foods. But it gets even more impressive. Native Americans performed successful surgical procedures that European doctors wouldn't attempt for centuries. They performed trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries or potentially to treat headaches and mental illnesses. And we know these were successful because archaeologists have found skulls showing healed trepanation wounds. The person survived the surgery and lived 4 years afterward. Think about that. They were performing brain surgery with stone tools, and patients were surviving and healing. Meanwhile, European surgery had a mortality rate so high that it was often seen as a last resort that would probably kill you anyway. Native Americans also performed amputations, set broken bones with splints, sutured wounds, and performed dental procedures. They had effective treatments for wounds that prevented infection. They understood the importance of cleanliness in medical treatment. Wounds were washed, tools were kept clean, and there was an understanding that dirty conditions led to worse outcomes. Some tribes practiced smallpox inoculation before European contact, using controlled exposure to create immunity. When the practice was discovered by Europeans and formalized as variolation, it was treated as a medical breakthrough, but some Native American groups were already doing it. Pain management was sophisticated too. Besides willow bark, they used other analgesics and even some plants with anesthetic properties. They understood how to induce different levels of consciousness for different procedures. They had treatments for snake bites, poisonous plant exposure, and other environmental hazards that were specific to their regions. This knowledge was detailed and specific. Not just this plant helps with snake bites, but this specific plant, prepared this specific way, helps with this specific type of snake bite. There was also sophisticated knowledge of women's health, herbs to ease childbirth, reduce bleeding, support lactation, contraceptive and abortifacient plants that were used for family planning, treatments for menstrual issues. This knowledge was typically held by women and passed down through generations. Psychological and spiritual health were also addressed, though in ways that European medicine didn't recognize as valid. But many of these practices of the communal support, the ritual and ceremony, the connection to nature align with what we now understand about mental health and the importance of community, meaning, and connection. Public health measures were also more advanced in some ways. Many tribes had hygiene practices that exceeded European standards. Regular bathing, waste management, food preparation standards, these things mattered and were practiced systematically. Now, I'm not saying Native American medicine was perfect or that it could treat everything. People still died from diseases and injuries. Life expectancy was impacted by many factors, but for the time period, and compared to European medicine of the same era, Native American medical knowledge was incredibly sophisticated. And here is the thing that should really make you think: much of this knowledge was almost lost. Boarding schools and cultural suppression tried to stamp out traditional practices, including medicine. Languages died, and with them, the medical knowledge encoded in those languages. Elders who held knowledge passed away before they could pass it on. We're only now beginning to fully appreciate and document what remains of this knowledge. There are efforts to preserve traditional medicine, to record the knowledge of elders, to integrate traditional and modern medicine in ways that respect both. Every time you take aspirin, every time you use a medication derived from plants, remember that there is a good chance Native Americans were using that plant medicinally long before modern pharmacology discovered it. FACT 6 of the boarding school system was cultural genocide that lasted until shockingly recently. All right, we need to talk about something dark. Really dark. But it's important because the effects are still being felt today, and a lot of people don't know this history at all. The last government-run Native American boarding school in the United States didn't close until 1969. Read that date again, 1969. That's not ancient history. That's the same year as Woodstock, the moon landing, and the Stonewall riots. That's within living memory for millions of Americans. But let's back up and talk about what these schools were and why they existed, because the full story is even worse than you probably imagine. Starting in the late 1800s and continuing through much of the 20th century, the U.S. government often in partnership with Christian churches, operated a system of boarding schools specifically designed to forcibly assimilate Native American children. The explicit, openly stated goal was captured in a phrase coined by Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't some covert operation with hidden motives. This was the official, stated purpose. Cultural genocide was the policy. Here's how it worked. Native American children, some as young as 4 or 5 years old, were forcibly taken from their families. In many cases, parents who resisted had their food rations cut off or faced other punishments. Indian agents would show up on reservations and literally take children away from their parents. These children were sent to boarding schools, often hundreds of miles from their homes, where they would stay for years without seeing their families. The moment they arrived, their transformation began. Their hair was cut, is significant in many native cultures where long hair had spiritual meaning. They were given uniforms and English names. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages. They were punished, often physically beaten, for any display of native culture or behavior. The punishments were brutal. Children were beaten for speaking their language. They were locked in closets, denied food, subjected to psychological abuse. Many schools had cemeteries on site because so many children died from disease, malnutrition, abuse, and even from attempting to run away. The curriculum was designed to erase native identity and replace it with Euro-American culture. They were taught that their cultures were savage and inferior. They were taught that their parents' ways were wrong. They were indoctrinated with Christianity and told their traditional spiritual beliefs were evil. Boys were trained in manual labor and trades. Girls were trained in domestic service. The idea was to turn them into workers who would serve Euro-American society and subordinate roles. This wasn't education designed to empower. This was education designed to assimilate and control. The schools were chronically underfunded. Children were often malnourished, lived in overcrowded conditions, and had inadequate medical care. Disease spread rapidly. Tuberculosis, influenza, and other illnesses killed thousands of children. Many of these deaths were never properly documented or reported to families. There are documented cases of physical and sexual abuse by school staff. Children who were supposed to be protected were instead victimized by the very people tasked with their care. And when children tried to report abuse or tried to run away, they were punished more severely. The psychological impact was devastating. Children were torn between two worlds, unable to fully return to their communities after years away, but never fully accepted in Euro-American society either. They'd been taught to be ashamed of their heritage, but they still faced racism and discrimination. Many developed what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD, depression, and other mental health issues. And the impacts didn't stop with that generation. Trauma gets passed down. Parents who grew up in boarding schools often didn't know how to be parents because they'd been separated from their own parents at a young age. They'd learned harsh discipline and emotional distance. They'd internalized shame about their culture. Languages were lost. When children couldn't speak their native language, they couldn't pass it on to the next generation. Today, many Native American languages are critically endangered or extinct. And boarding schools are a major reason why. Cultural practices were lost when children weren't taught traditional skills, ceremonies, and knowledge. Entire bodies of cultural information disappeared. Elders who held knowledge passed away before they could pass it on to a generation that had been taken away during their formative years. Now here are the dates you really need to know. The first boarding school, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, opened in 1879. The system expanded rapidly. At its peak, there were over 350 government-funded boarding schools across the United States. The last of these schools didn't close until 1969. But wait, there's more. In Canada, which had a similar residential school system, the last school didn't close until 1996. 1996, that's the same year the Nintendo 64 came out. That's the year Dolly the sheep was cloned. That's practically yesterday. In historical terms, Canada has officially acknowledged its residential school system as cultural genocide. In 2008, the Canadian government issued a formal apology. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented the abuses and made recommendations for healing and reconciliation. The United States has been slow to reckon with this history. In 2021, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, herself a Native American, launched the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative to investigate the boarding school system and document its impacts. As of my last update, this investigation is ongoing. What they're finding is horrifying. Hundreds of unmarked graves at former boarding school sites. Evidence of systematic abuse and neglect. Documentation of deaths that were never properly reported. Stories from survivors that reveal the full extent of the trauma. And remember, this isn't distant history. There are people alive today who attended these schools. There are families still searching for answers about children who were taken and never came home. There are communities still dealing with the intergenerational trauma of having their children systematically stolen and abused. This is why, when people ask why Native American communities face higher rates of poverty, substance abuse, domestic violence, and other social issues, you can't understand it without understanding this context. You can't systematically traumatize multiple generations of people and then act surprised when those communities struggle. The boarding school system was an attempt at cultural genocide. It was an attempt to erase Native American peoples and cultures from existence. Not through direct killing, though many children died, but through forced assimilation, and it happened within living memory. FACT-7, Native Americans shaped and managed American ecosystems for thousands of years. Here's something that's going to completely reframe how you think about the American landscape. When European colonists arrived and saw what they described as pristine wilderness, virgin forest, and untouched nature, they were actually looking at carefully managed landscapes that had been shaped by Native Americans for thousands of years. The wilderness wasn't wild. It was a garden that had been tended for millennia. And when the people who'd been tending that garden suddenly disappeared due to disease, the garden went wild and grew over, which is what the colonists saw and interpreted as natural, untouched wilderness. Let me explain what I mean. Native Americans actively managed landscapes across the entire continent using a variety of sophisticated techniques. The most widespread and important of these was controlled burning, also called prescribed burning or cultural burning. Native Americans would deliberately set fires during specific seasons, under specific weather conditions, to achieve specific ecological goals. This was random or destructive. This was carefully planned land management based on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. What did these controlled burns accomplish? First, they prevented catastrophic wildfires. By regularly burning underbrush and small vegetation, they eliminated the fuel load that would otherwise accumulate and create massive, uncontrollable fires. Small, controlled fires prevented big, destructive ones. Second, burning created and maintained meadows and prairies. Without regular fire, many of these areas would naturally succeed to forest. But Native Americans maintained open grasslands because these areas attracted game animals like deer, elk, and buffalo. More game meant better hunting, which meant more food security. Third, fire promoted the growth of certain plants that native peoples relied on for food, medicine, and materials. Many plants actually require fire to germinate or thrive. Berries, for example, produce more abundantly after fire. Certain grasses, nuts, and tubers used as food sources benefited from regular burning. Fourth, burning improved forest health. It cleared out diseased trees, reduced pest populations, and promoted the growth of fire-resistant tree species. Old-growth forests that Europeans marveled at were often old-growth specifically because fire had prevented them from being choked out by younger trees and underbrush. The scale of this was enormous. It's estimated that Native Americans regularly burned millions of acres across North America. The landscape that colonists saw was as much a product of human management as it was of natural processes. But controlled burning was just one technique. Native Americans also managed forests by selectively removing or encouraging certain tree species, creating what we'd now call food forests where useful plants were concentrated. They managed freshwater resources, creating fish weirs and managing stream habitats to enhance fish populations. In the Pacific Northwest, Indigenous peoples created clam gardens in intertidal zones where they built rock walls to extend and enhance clam habitat. These structures increased shellfish production and are still visible today. This was aquaculture, not just harvesting. They managed wildlife populations through hunting practices designed to maintain sustainable numbers. They understood seasonal patterns, breeding cycles, and population dynamics. Overhunting was avoided because it was understood that depleting game populations would lead to hunger later. So what happened when 90% of the native population died from diseases in the century following? First contact, the landscape management stopped. Nobody was setting the controlled burns. Nobody was maintaining the meadows and prairies. Nobody was managing the forests. And the landscape changed rapidly. Forests grew denser. Prairies shrank or disappeared. The fire regime changed, leading to bigger, more destructive wildfires. Animal populations shifted as habitats changed. The carefully managed garden became an overgrown wilderness. When the Pilgrims arrived in New England, for example, they described open, park-like forests with trees spaced far enough apart that you could easily walk through them. They described abundant game. They described meadows and grasslands. This landscape existed because the native people of the region had been managing it for thousands of years. But by the time colonists spread inland, diseases had already swept ahead of them, killing most of the native population. What colonists saw was an abandoned landscape already several decades into rewilding. They saw forests growing back and assumed this was the natural state. They saw what appeared to be wilderness and concluded that Native Americans had lived in harmony with nature without altering it. But this interpretation was backwards. Native Americans had extensively altered North American ecosystems, not through destructive exploitation, but through informed management that increased biodiversity, productivity, and resilience. Modern ecology is increasingly recognizing this. Fire ecologists now understand that many North American ecosystems evolved with regular fire and need fire to remain healthy. The catastrophic wildfires we see today in the western U.S. are partly a result of fire suppression policies that allowed fuel loads to build up over decades. Some land managers are now working with Native American communities to reintroduce cultural burning practices. These controlled burns are proving effective at reducing wildfire risk while also restoring ecosystem health and promoting biodiversity. The idea of pristine wilderness untouched by human hands was always a myth. North America was shaped by its indigenous inhabitants for thousands of years. Understanding this changes how we think about conservation, land management, and what natural even means. Alright, so we've covered 7 of the most surprising facts about Native Americans that rarely make it into textbooks, and honestly, we've barely scratched the surface. We could do another video just as long covering 13 more facts, and then another after that. But let's talk about why this matters. Why should you care about history that's been left out of textbooks? Why does it matter if most Americans don't know about Cahokia, or the Iroquois Confederacy's influence on the Constitution or the boarding school system? It matters because history shapes how we understand the present. When we learn an incomplete or inaccurate version of history, it distorts our understanding of current issues and ongoing injustices. When people ask why Native American communities face higher rates of poverty, substance abuse, and health problems, you can't answer that question without understanding the historical context. The boarding schools, the forced relocations, the broken treaties, the systematic destruction of economies and cultures. These aren't ancient history, their effects are still being felt today. When people talk about land rights or sovereignty issues, you can't understand what's at stake without knowing that the US government systematically violated treaties. That land was stolen through fraudulent agreements and outright force. That reservations were deliberately placed on the least productive land available. When people are surprised that Native Americans still exist and still maintain distinct cultures, that surprise is a direct result of the vanishing Indian propaganda that we talked about. It is a result of history classes that treat Native Americans as historical figures who existed in the past rather than as contemporary peoples with ongoing histories. The real story of Native Americans isn't a story of inevitable conquest by a superior civilization. It's not a story of primitive peoples giving way to progress. It's a much more complex story about advanced civilizations with sophisticated technologies, about deliberate policies of cultural destruction, about incredible resilience and survival, and about ongoing struggles for rights, recognition, and justice. It's a story about the Iroquois Confederacy influencing American democracy, about Cahokia rivaling the great cities of medieval Europe, about agricultural and medical knowledge that was ahead of its time, about landscapes that were carefully managed gardens, about a population collapse so severe it changed the planet's climate, about cultural genocide through the boarding school system, about peoples and cultures that refused to vanish despite everything thrown at them. These aren't alternative facts or fringe interpretations. This is mainstream scholarship, backed by archaeological evidence, historical documents, and the testimony of native peoples themselves. It's just history that's been left out of the standard narrative. And that's the real question we should be asking: why was this history left out? Who benefits from an incomplete telling of American history? What does it say about our society that we can systematically erase the achievements and contributions of entire peoples? I'll leave you with this thought: history isn't just about the past. It's about how we understand ourselves and our world today. When we learn a more complete, more accurate history, it changes how we see everything. it makes us question assumptions. It reveals injustices. It shows us that things we thought were inevitable were actually choices. The facts I've shared today are surprising not because they're obscure or debatable, but because they've been systematically excluded from mainstream education. That exclusion is itself part of the story. If this video opened your eyes to something new, if it made you question what else you weren't taught in school, then it's done its job. Drop a comment letting me know which fact surprised you the most. Share this with someone who would benefit from learning this history. And subscribe because we're going to keep digging into the history they didn't teach you. Knowledge is power, but only if we're willing to seek out the full story, not just the convenient version. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.